This film will draw upon information which you have already covered to show you how you might need to use it in an essay. You could be asked questions regarding the relationship between faith, reason and revelation. You might be asked questions relating to this in Part A or Part B, and you will be required to apply the appropriate scholars to the debate. This film does briefly include a couple of extra scholars too who might be helpful. The following ideas are raised by the WJEC as the kinds of issues you should weigh up when answering a question. You should see them as themes here that we have already talked about when in previous lessons about an individual scholar. For instance, Kierkegaard would argue that it is better to use your heart in matters of faith, and James would say that sometimes we should rely on our passional nature to guide us. Buber would argue that reason leads us to fides but never fiducia. Aquinas would argue that faith and reason are both needed in order to understand God. We will look at a range of types of responses in turn. This is the kind of approach that you have heard before from scholars like Kierkegaard, Pascal and Barth, to name but three. It is also an approach that the Protestant reformer Martin Luther advocated by pointing out that reason is corrupt since it was subject to the fall. Since we cannot rely upon our own faculties for truth, it is better to rely upon those that we can trust, the revelation directly from God. For Luther, much like the other voluntarists we've looked at, he felt that faith is fiducia, an exercise in trust which is a risk. Faith is a free personal choice to believe that is made independent of rational evidence. What is believed by faith may sometimes be paradoxical if we apply reason, so we cannot seek reassurance from reason. This kind of approach we have heard from the likes of Aquinas, from Anselm, Augustine, and John Calvin. In their different ways, they all claim that faith has rational foundation that can be visible to all. For Anselm, of course, we are talking about fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding. For Aquinas, reason is a gift from God, and we can seek knowledge of him through the application of natural theology. The difference that is important here is how reason is applied. For Anselm, of course, we know that reason alone can lead us to understand the existence of God. There is no need for empirical support. This is a rationalist approach. For Aquinas, reason is best applied through natural theology or empiricist reasoning, much like Aristotle had applied in ancient Greece. We can see God's handiwork in creation. For these scholars, faith and reason support each other, and there need be no distinction or conflict between the two. Scholars like William James are handy for this approach, since his approach does not dismiss the need for reason but acknowledges that reason sometimes cannot help, and in fact it is useful to be able to rely on faith rather than reason for certain things. His pragmatism points out that as long as it is a live option, we can rely upon faith without resort to reason at all. Alvin Plantinga is another scholar who takes this approach. Let's consider him for a moment. Plantinga challenges the beliefs of foundationalists. Foundationalists claim that there are categories of belief that are said to be basic. This means that some beliefs underpin all other beliefs and are those on which all other beliefs are based. Foundationalists say that for a belief to be properly basic, it needs to be evident. So, for example, I need to be able to see it. It should be obvious. In addition, it should be incorrigible or impossible to refute. Analytic truth could be said to be incorrigible. We cannot dispute them. Self-evident statements too would be incorrigible, since statements that are obvious or need no proof, such as "a cabbage is not an apple," can count as basic. Basic beliefs are also compelled. We cannot believe anything else. Memory statements and firmly set beliefs, such as statements from experience, can be basic. The foundationalists would claim that the existence of God cannot come under any of these headings, and thus cannot be seen to be properly basic. Plantinga takes a non-foundationalist approach then, and claims that since foundationalism seems to reject both the existence of other human minds and historical statements under its criteria, it must be irrational. He claims instead that a belief in God is a basic belief, since it not only underpins all other beliefs that a person might hold about this world, but is also grounded in personal religious experience of God as opposed to physical evidence. Therefore, we shouldn't require reason in order to support religious faith. Belief in God is properly basic. R. M. Hare agrees that there is no need for reason or proof for a belief in God. He characterises belief in God as a blick. This is a kind of life view or way of experiencing the world. A blick is when you see the world in a particular light, then that colours the way you perceive all other things. We all see the world from our own blick. There will be a rationalist blick in which all empirical evidence is to be treated with caution, as it may be flawed or illusionary. There is an empiricist blick, where you perceive empirical evidence as being the route to true knowledge. Faith is a blick which allows the believer to see the world as being the work of a creator God, and then live their lives with this idea colouring the way they see all things. This is an idea that John Hick has explored as he talks of seeing as and experiencing as. He points out that we all see the world in a different way and uses the duck-rabbit optical illusion to demonstrate. Some people look at the picture and see it as a duck, others see it as a rabbit. In life we experience as because we see the world from our different perspectives, and this would mean that whilst one person would experience a rainbow, say, as a reflection of light upon water particles, another person would experience a rainbow as a message from God. Hick goes on to say that whilst religious claims have many features in common with empirical statements, they are propositional, they are objects of assent, an agent can act upon them and we feel convictions about them when they are challenged. They have distinct differences too. Religious perception is not coercive, it is not universal, and it is not coherent within time and space. From these differences, Hick concludes that religious faith is a basic interpretation of significance in human experience. Faith is not the result of logical reasoning, but instead is a profession that God is part of a believer's experience. Religious faith, then, interprets reality in terms of God's presence within the believer's experience. Even though a religious believer cannot prove their claims, their religious belief still has a status of knowledge. Even if one could prove God's existence, this fact alone would be a form of knowledge neither necessary nor sufficient for one's faith. It would at best only force a notional assent, fides. Believers live not by confirmed hypotheses, but by an intense, coercive, personal experience of the divine. We have already explored the work of Lewis. His approach is, of course, that you must have reason to believe something. Clifford would, of course, argue that we must apply reason and thus faith cannot be rationally justified. Wittgenstein would argue that a statement of faith is like a game that is being played with language. In fact, all language is part of a game, but the rules of the game are different depending upon which game you are part of. If you are part of a science language game, you will apply the rules in a particular way. For example, the statements that you claim are true will need to be verified with supporting empirical evidence. However, not all language is used in this way. According to the science rules, I cannot claim to make any true statement unless it is verifiable, in which case I cannot claim to be in love or to be sad. Equally, I cannot claim that something happened to me yesterday. Such statements become meaningless. However, Wittgenstein claimed that this is not in fact the case. Clearly such statements are meaningful, but different game rules are being applied when they are used. They are not part of the science language game. The same is true of statements of faith. In fact, what is true in a faith language game will not require the same kind of evidence as that of a science game. To request it is nonsense, because it would be like challenging the behaviour of players in a rugby game by using the rules of chess. Clearly, a game of chess does not require us to tackle our opponent. If we did this in a chess game, we'd be disqualified. It's a nonsense, though, to claim that a rugby player is committing a foul when he or she does tackle just because you can't in chess. The two games are different and must be treated as such. Faith cannot be criticised for not being rational. The game of faith is not the same as the game of reason, and it can't be criticised for being different.